Welcome to the Mlb Strategy Show right here on Awesemo.com. Happy Friday to you. We're going to get you ready for Game 3 of Rays and Dodgers tonight, Adam. Great to chat with you here on a Friday. Of course, we've had a tale of two games, tied now 1-1. After Game 2, I know Frank Thomas was kind of going at the Dodgers here for kind of giving this one away, going with the bullpen game, which maybe kind of says that they think this is going to be a 7-game series.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting they went that approach in Game 2, but now you get a rested bullpen, you get Walker Buehler coming back as an actual starting pitcher. So tonight's game should be more traditional. You have two actual starting pitchers going in this one, so a bit different from Game 2, more similar to Game 1, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of see if somehow the Rays are able to get to Walker early on in this game, if they have to go that bullpen aspect of it and what the Dodger bullpen is going to be like, the fact of they had to use 7 pitchers in Game 2.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, they were able to avoid using Julio Urias. That game, kind of got out of hand relatively quickly, so they didn't use the most competitive arms they had. So I'm not too concerned about the shape of their bullpen. Like, I think that they should be fine for any sort of competitive game today. I mean, you look at who they used in that game. The most pitches anyone threw was Alex Wood with 26, Dustin May threw 25. So their actual relievers really weren't worked heavily at all. Kenley Jansen didn't come in. Pedro Baez didn't come in. Those are guys that you'd be using towards the back end. Trinan didn't pitch. And then as far as long guys go, Julio Urias didn't pitch. So as far as, functionally for this game, guys that they would want to use, they're pretty fresh.
Of course, this is the MLB Strategy Show. We are sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. They are the most trusted name in fantasy sports. Yahoo DFS does include CSV upload, CSV edit features where you're looking to play those multiple lineups, make better choices. Choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. Let's get right into the pitching in terms of this one. Let's talk about the starting pitchers. You mentioned about Walker going up against Charlie Morton here. Walker as the captain on DK, 15-6, 15 even for Charlie, and then in the utility spot, 10-4 for Walker and 10 even for Charlie. Give me your take on, obviously, Charlie Morton has been a stud in the postseason for the Rays. So let's start with Charlie Morton's side of this, and what do you see from him tonight?
Yeah, so it's clearly a tough matchup for him going up against the Dodgers. It's going to be any time in the series that you have two legitimate starters going in the same game and neither team is going with the bullpen approach, you're pretty much going to prefer the Dodgers starter just because he's facing the Rays as opposed to facing the Dodgers. So it is a tough matchup for Morton. You do get a bit of a price discount on him. He's coming a little bit lower owned than Walker Buehler. Our ownership just came out about 8 minutes ago. And I think that should be the case. We have 21% captain ownership going to Morton, 36% going to Buehler. As far as utility ownership, though, only 9% going to Buehler, 26% going to Morton because he is a little bit less expensive. I don't know if if that ownership comes up on Buehler. I think that it probably should. But I think that, Buehler you're going to prefer, but Morton, assuming he's going to be, he's stretched out. He's an actual starter. So I think that especially in cash games, you're going to want both pitchers, but even in tournaments, using them at flex, you'll still be able to get good enough hitters in that I would expect to be rostering a lot of pitching today.
I know one of the questions we've already got in here is about relief pitchers and, maybe who should we be looking at as potential targets?
So this isn't a slate that I'm nearly as interested in that. I think that, because again, both starters should just go deeper into the game, but something Josh and I had talked about prior to Game 2, because, we had said at the beginning that showdown baseball is a pretty new format to us. We haven't really played it until now. So we're still kind of, trying to figure it out and give our thoughts along the way. But one thing that I felt like I underestimated Game 1 was the viability of using back end relievers that are, like $4,400, because even if you get you can get some hitters down in that 4 to 5K range, but it's still really easy for them to get 0 points. So in large field tournaments, taking that ownership discount and going with a reliever can make some sense. Looking at the pricing today, you have Pedro Baez at 4,400. You have Kenley Jansen also coming in at 4,400. I think that in a competitive game, you're likely to get Baez. If the game is a little bit less competitive, you're likely to get Jansen. Either of those guys should probably give you around an inning here. So, you're talking if they get in, probably 3 to 4 points most likely. So you can use either of those guys in large field tournaments, not guys I'd be looking at in cash, not guys I'd be overly concerned about in your smaller field, 3-max or single entry stuff.
I mean, I think the question on the Charlie Morton side of this is, can he make it to the 6th inning?
Right. And that's obviously a big concern. He hasn't reached 100 pitches at least since August 4th. I don't have any game logs beyond that in front of me, but he was pulled really quickly in his last start against Houston, went 5 2/3 innings, was pitching well. They pulled him at 66 pitches, basically at the first sign of trouble, which was really weird. I don't really know if it's just a case of him being someone that Kevin Cash is particularly paying particularly close attention to, not going a third time through the order, or what the deal is there. But we have seen a quick hook with Morton. I think that is a bit of a concern. That being said, he's been efficient, with his scoring, basically. Even though he's not getting 100 pitches, he's still going out there and giving you solid fantasy performances. So I'm not really concerned about Morton's leash. I think that he obviously should be projected behind Walker Buehler in terms of points, but I think that he at least has a long enough leash that he's still a good play for fantasy purposes.
Yeah, I mean, my thing with the Rays when it comes to relief pitchers is I just don't feel like Cash is going to stick them in there very long. They're going to get 3-4 batters, and they're probably going to be right out of the game.
Right. You have Tampa playing matchups. They activated an extra left-handed reliever for this series in Ryan Sheriff over Aaron Slegers. So it's even, one more guy that they can use just for matchups. Obviously, you have the 3-batter rule unless an inning ends. But other than that, there's nothing really limiting Tampa from what they can do. If you go back to Wednesday, Pete Fairbanks threw 23 pitches, Nick Anderson threw 19. So I would assume that they're both available. I assume Tampa has their entire bullpen here. If you want to take a shot on like a Peter Fairbanks, who should probably pitch as long as the game's competitive, but the problem there is he's 5,600, so he's not even at that same price point as Baez and Jansen are. Nick Anderson is 4,800, so you could take a shot at him. But again, I'm not really expecting more than an inning, maybe an inning and a third or something out of these guys.
Yeah, I mean, that to me would be a concern with the Rays. Of course, the Rays bats did come alive there. We saw Brandon Lau finally come out of the slump that he is in. So we're going to talk about hitting here momentarily. I do want to let you know today's free premium content over at Awesemo.com is MLB player projections. So you can check that out right now there at Awesemo.com. Of course, be sure to hit that like button here on this video, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when new videos are posted, and we are live right here on YouTube. Let's talk about the hitting side in this one. I mentioned about the Rays bats coming alive in the last game, particularly Brandon Lau, who has been just god-awful throughout the postseason. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people watching that are probably the same boat that I am, that we been riding that Brandon Lau train for the entire postseason, and finally it paid off for us.
Yeah, it was nice to see him finally break out. It was kind of funny, too, because Kevin Cash had a quote. I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but it was something along the lines of something that had happened in game 1 made him think things were going to turn around for Lau. And it was kind of one of those quotes that you hear it, and it was just coach speak, and you don't really think anything of it. And then Lau comes out and immediately hits 2 home runs in game 2. So, maybe Cash knew what he was talking about. But, yeah, it's good to see Lau get it turned around. Obviously, whenever you talk about guys going through hitting slumps in baseball, you don't want to be adjusting your lineups or your projections all that much. It just happens. There's nothing really, just because someone has had 10 bad games in a row or something like that, it's normally not going to be predictive of what happens in the future. So you kind of just want to ride through it, and then it's just really nice when they finally do turn it around, like Lau did last game. So he's still affordable. Decent spot against Morton. Morton has given up a lot more power to lefties, against Buehler. Buehler's given up a lot more power to righties, actually, than lefties. This season, a 252 expected ISO to righties, 120 to lefties. Looking at last year, 164 to righties, 127 to lefties. So, if you're splitting hairs, maybe look to like a Rosarena from the right side, but he is more expensive. I think Lau's salary is fine. No issues going back to him today.
Yeah, just looking at the utility over on TK, Rosarena 9,800 in utility, Brandon Lau 8,600. I mean, I think it kind of raised that question on DK of, do you put a hitter in the captain spot as opposed to maybe going with one of the pitchers?
I definitely wouldn't in cash games. In tournaments, it's a more reasonable consideration. One thing I did notice, kind of just looking back through lineup study on Fantasy Cruncher at previous slates, was, and I mean, it's obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but on the slates where starting pitching did reasonably well, you typically needed a starter at captain. And the reason I bring that up isn't to say, yeah, you if the pitcher does well, you need to have him. Like, that's obvious, but you, like, looking at this game, you do expect there's a pretty good chance that a starting pitcher does well, since you have two actual starting pitchers that are good going. This isn't like last game where you had Blake Snell, who has huge questions of his own, and then you had the Dodgers clearly going with a bullpen approach. So you actually have two starting pitchers here. That being said, you do get a lot of ownership going there. I mean, right now we have a projected 57% of ownership going to either Charlie Morton or Walker Buehler at captain. And I don't think that's bad. It's obviously going to project really well. But the thing to keep in mind with baseball is that one home run from anybody puts you in the same range as the median projection for either pitcher. Of course, it's really difficult to guess which guy hits the home run. But when you're talking tournaments and trying to differentiate, you're getting such low ownership on basically every hitter, with the exception of Austin Meadows, who's still way, way too cheap. You're getting such low ownership there that if you're playing a bunch of lineups in larger field stuff, I think there is merit to going that route, because you're going to be competing with a lot smaller percentage of the field, if you just happen to get on the right hitter captain. So I think my captain approach depends a lot on what contests I'm playing and how many people I have to beat.
Yeah, looking at the ownership and seeing that Kevin Kierme, obviously because of that salary, is getting a lot. He's just one of those guys that raised lineup. I just can't trust him.
Yeah, but I mean, the counter to that is, and again, there's a huge difference. There's probably a bigger difference in baseball than any other sport between how you view cash games and how you view tournaments, because there's so much volatility in baseball as opposed to other sports. So like in cash games, there's no real reason to be getting away from Kevin Kierme at his price point, because he's going to let you get Walker Buehler captain. He's going to let you get other good plays in your lineup. In tournaments, he's still a fine play because he's so cheap and he lets you get upside elsewhere in your lineup. But whenever you're talking about a hitter that's going to get, right now we have him projected for 55% utility ownership and 5% captain ownership, so about 60% aggregate ownership in tournaments, you're still talking about a hitter. For one, any hitter can get zero, a relatively high percentage of the time. Two, that hitter is Kevin Kierme, who's not one of the better hitters on Tampa. He's sitting at the bottom of the order, so he's losing in at bat in a lot of cases. Whenever you have that much ownership going there, you can just be different by not rostering the 4K hitter. So in tournaments, I think, again, larger field especially, there's more merit to getting away from Kierme, just hoping that he throws up a zero. In smaller field stuff where you're competing against fewer players, and certainly in cash games, I'm more inclined to take the savings with Kierme and then try and be different somewhere else in my line.
Look, as a Rays fan, I know why Kevin Kierme is in the lineup. It's not what he's doing at the plate, it's what he's doing in center field.
Which actually is kind of valuable for DFS, though, because, like, for example, game one, you had a situation where Hunter Renfroe was starting for Tampa and Jock Peterson was starting for the Dodgers. And it was pretty clear that if the game was competitive, both of those guys were going to be pinch hit for as soon as you got into the bullpen. Whereas with Kevin Kierme, there was virtually zero chance of him being pinch hit for. You're not pinch running for Kevin Kierme. He's fast. And you're not pinch hitting for him because you need him in the outfield playing defense. So like you said, the reason he's playing is his defensive ability, but that actually does carry some value for a hitter as cheap as he is, because there's no pinch hit risk there. He's too good defensively to take out of the lineup.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the ownership difference between DraftKings and FanDuel, it's a drastic difference. When we're talking about Kevin Kierme, while you mentioned between captain and utility, 60+% ownership, over on FanDuel, it's only 20%.
Yeah, FanDuel has him at 5K. So he's actually, when you compare him to other hitters, I mean, on FanDuel, he's the same price as Ji-Man Choi. He's more expensive than Joey Wendell. I couldn't even say it without laughing that Kevin Kierme is the same price as Ji-Man Choi. It's obviously you're going to prefer Choi. You're going to look to there's so many other bats that you can pivot to. Austin Barnes, if he's in the lineup, is $1,000 less than Kierme. So he doesn't have that same value. He's more expensive than Adames too. He doesn't have that same value on FanDuel because there's just a lot of really cheap hitters. Whereas on DraftKings, if you're foregoing Kierme, it's going to force you in the direction of probably not being able to get both starting pitchers, almost definitely not being able to get one of them at captain, and having the roster some other not very good hitters. So it makes a much bigger difference in roster construction on DraftKings than it does on FanDuel.
I mean, I'm looking at the FanDuel salaries or ownership, I should say. And of course, we know no pitcher, so we're just looking at hitting. And of course, the top three ownership we're seeing in terms of captain, they're all Dodgers, which, I mean, should be a surprise. I mean, I think we would expect that just because with the Rays bats, I mean, look, if I'm looking at who am I going? Maybe it's, Austin Meadows is getting the most when it comes to the Rays in terms of ownerships. Maybe Brandon Lau is out of this slump, and maybe if you want to target a Ray in that MVP spot on FanDuel, maybe it's Brandon Lau.
Yeah, a little bit of an ownership discount there for Lau versus Meadows. I do agree that Meadows should be the highest owned just because I think he is the best hitter there and his salary is affordable. But there's in the context of one baseball game, Brandon Lau, for all intents and purposes, has the exact same ceiling as Austin Meadows. Both these guys have massive power. So yeah, like whichever one is lower owned in tournaments, you're not making a bad play if you just pivot. But it's certainly not something you have to do because, again, something that we talk about a lot, your tournament lineups, you need to view them in the context of your entire lineup, not just one player. So you don't want to just go into it saying, oh, the biggest edge on the slate is playing Brandon Lau over Austin Meadows, because that's crazy. It's the same play. If you're contrarian somewhere else, Austin Meadows does project slightly higher. So there's no problem with going to Meadows, but it's whichever one's lower owned is going to be fine in terms of just looking at it one player versus one player.
We mentioned about the value of Kevin Kierme on DraftKings at 4,000. Who's the best value bat you see out of the Dodgers? I mean, it's kind of hard because, if you look at the lowest salary bat here, it would be Austin Barnes at 4,800 to say he's in the lineup. But is there any of those Dodger bats that you think you were getting a discount on?
Not really. Like Barnes is clearly the best value, but he's also still getting plenty of ownership, almost 40% combined ownership. So he is coming in at a discount to Kierme among the value bats, but he's still pretty popular. The Dodgers, I don't think offer the same value. They're more of like a luxury that you can get to if you use Kierme or, I guess if you use Barnes. But I think that they are priced a lot less favorably than Tampa as a whole. I mean, you even look to like AJ Pollock, who should probably be batting seventh, $7,200. So he's more expensive than I'm pretty sure like the entire Tampa lineup, except for Meadows, Lau, and Rosarena.
One of the questions in the chat from David, he says, who are the 4 to 5 players who won't get pinch hit for? I mean, and when I look at that question, I just say, well, we must just talk about the Rays because I feel like the Rays are going to be the ones doing the pinch hitting.
Yeah, and it's tough because a lot of it depends also on game situation. We even saw Austin Meadows get pinch hit for in the 7th inning the other day. So Lau's not getting pinch hit for. One thing that you can kind of fall back on to try and work through this on your own is think about what a lineup looks like when a left-handed pitcher starts. Obviously the Dodgers are starting a righty today, but think about what the lineup looked like when Kershaw started. Brandon Lau was still in the lineup. So you assume they're not pinch hitting for him if a lefty comes in. Kevin Kierme was still in the lineup. You assume they're not pinch hitting for him if a lefty comes in because they need him defensively. Lau just hits lefties well, so there's no reason to pinch hit for him. But Austin Meadows has some pinch hit risk. G-Man Choi has pinch hit risk for sure. Joey Wendell, you could pinch hit for. As far as the righties go, I think they're pretty safe. Rosarena is not going anywhere. Manny Margot should be fine. Adames isn't going anywhere, and Zunino should be okay. So I think the pinch hit risks for Tampa are Meadows, Choi, and to some extent Wendell. And the problem there is, of course, Meadows is one of the best values on the slate. He's the best hitter, one of the best hitters, at least on Tampa. So you're still going to roster him. You just have to know that there's late inning pinch hit potential if the Dodgers bring in a lefty. And the same goes for Choi because, he's probably batting cleanup. He's got a lot of power, but they can just go to Yandy Diaz as soon as the Dodgers bring a lefty in.
Yeah, Choi is the first one that sticks out to me. Bruce Howell, I think, is another potential as one they could bring in there as well. But, you mentioned this great point. It's all going to come down to what's the situation in the game. Anyone who's followed the Rays for the last 10 years, they know that this is a very analytic-driven team. That they've got a card that Kevin Cash has that's going to give every single situation of who should go into the game. Now, is there any on the Dodgers? We did see them use pinch runners at the end of their lineup in game 2, but any concerns on potential maybe who could lose in a bat or so?
Not too much. AJ Pollock would probably be my biggest concern because you can throw Edwin Rios or Jock Peterson in there. I mentioned it before game 2. If Will Smith is catching and Austin Barnes is DHing, Austin Barnes carries pinch hit risk. If Barnes is catching and Smith is DHing, Barnes should be safe because pinch hitting for him too early would mean that you're losing your designated hitter. So that's something to pay attention to, but Pollock would probably be the biggest risk for me. I think you also could just see Jock Peterson start over Austin Barnes today. Potentially Smith catch, Jock DH. So that's certainly possible too. But out of the projected lineup, I think Pollock carries the most risk of potentially late in the game seeing Jock Peterson get in the lineup. If Jock starts, then Jock obviously has pinch hit risk because he'll be gone as lefty comes in.
Yeah, that's a concern I have with going with Jock. As you look at the ownership, I mean, let's look at the DK side of things. Is there a Dodger bat that you just look at and say, man, that ownership's getting pretty high? I might need to give it a little less.
Barnes, I guess, but that's more. So Barnes is one of those guys where if I'm playing 150 lineups in a large field tournament, I think I'd probably get around the field on him just because I'm probably not going to want to play like 100% Kierme, and going to those value bats is going to be useful. In 3-max stuff, I probably would just stay away from Barnes at 40% ownership and, hope Austin Barnes doesn't beat me. So I think, his ownership may be driven up a little bit too high. Looking at the rest of the Dodgers, Pollock at 30%. Again, maybe not even in the lineup. He's in projected lineups right now, but it wouldn't be surprising at all if Jock Peterson got the start. In which case he would probably be popular. And again, you want to keep in mind that he's not getting in a bat against the lefty unless the game is already out of hand. So that would be something to pay attention to. But amongst the rest of them, I don't think the ownership looks too high because DraftKings did really price these guys up relative to Tampa Bay. It's just going to be tough to get to them. Like, I have no issue rostering a 25% owned Will Smith or Cody Bellinger. The price or the ownership on Turner and Taylor and Muncy, it goes down really as you get better in hitters, with Seager and Betts being the 2 lowest owned hitters from the Dodgers. So I don't really have any issue whatsoever with any ownership on the Dodgers.
Now, if you do want to place a bet on the game, go to Awesemo.com, go over to Odds Shopper so you can price out the books right now. Looking at the best bets we have, Dodgers minus 149. And then the best line right now on the Rays, pretty much across the board with them, plus 135 in terms of that. The run line on the game, the total on the game, over 7.5. I might go under on that one.
7.5?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's 2 good pitchers. It's 2 bullpens that had a day off. We're kind of due to see a game that doesn't have runs either, for lack of a better word. So, yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, of course, this is the Mlb Strategy Show right here at Awesemo.com. Be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe notification bell so you know we have a new show coming up. One of the popular questions that's been asked a couple times, got asked on Slack, also got asked on YouTube. Slack was basically along the lines of, hey, how often is going with 2 pitchers going to be optimal for you?
So yeah, I mean, I'll wait on Josh's Sims for the actual answer to that, but it's obviously really slate dependent. On slates like today, it's going to be a lot higher percentage than, for example, game 2. Game 2, it was pretty obvious that there was a really low percentage that any Dodgers pitcher was going to be in an optimal lineup, just because of the bullpen game. Whereas today, it's pretty likely. I mean, because you have to think about it from just kind of the way the game works too. Like, if Buehler and Morton both pitch well, hitters are naturally doing worse also. And both of these pitchers can go, 5-6 innings. They can put up 20 plus fantasy points. So there's a relatively good chance that both pitchers are in the optimal today. I think it's reflected, in their ownership as well.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of questions we got was, Sterling says, would you play both stars in GPPs? Kevin, is this a night to play both pitchers? Antoine saying 2 pitchers is the way to go if you feel comfortable squeezing them both in.
Yeah, I think it is a good 2-pitcher slate. As far as the GPP question, you kind of have to think about your specific risk approach and all that too. Like, there are some people who, like, the last thing they want to do is dupe a lineup in a large field tournament, in which case, yeah, maybe don't play both pitchers because it's going to really limit the rest of your options. For me personally, I think that approach is too far off base, and you need a massive bankroll to be able to sustain that, because you're just going to end up not cashing tournaments that much, and you need to basically be able to afford to play forever until you get first place. So for me, where I'm not overly concerned about that, and I just accept that I'm going to dupe some lineups, and I'm going to have, I'm going to play the same lineups as some people. I have no issue whatsoever playing the two pitchers together, because they both grade out really well for me. Like I'm going to be trying to do something within a tournament lineup to be contrarian, to be unique, but I'm not going to just forego what I think is the best strategy on the slate just because other people are doing it too.
What's your strategy for cash?
I would be shocked if I don't have both pitchers in cash. The reason being that, for one, they're both really popular, and taking a stand in cash against the two highest projected players on the slate seems really bad. Also, just with the way baseball is, the floor for every hitter, no matter how good they are, is zero. And for pitchers, it's a bit higher. So you are just getting more points in your lineup. You're getting more medium points, you're getting a higher ceiling, you're getting a higher floor by rostering pitchers. So there's really no way I'm not rostering both pitchers in cash.
For someone who's a single entry GPP player, I mean, would the advice be go with two pitchers, or would the advice be go pick one just to try to make yourself different?
So the first thing off the top of my head, or kind of, because I haven't made tournament lineups yet, obviously, or started ranking them, but I would be inclined to possibly, roster one pitcher like Buehler captain, but then five hitters. The problem you run into there is that the five hitters you're going to be able to afford are facing Buehler. But you could also, the approach that I went with game one, which I think is pretty similar to this one. I had 100% Clayton Kershaw, but I rostered him at flex instead of at captain. And then I just, hope to get the right hitter. Like in 3 max, I think I had a Kevin Kierme captain. I think I had a Manny Margot captain and a Yandy Diaz captain. The Kevin Kierme captain obviously worked out. I got second place in like the $150 3 max. So it was a different lineup because so many people that did play Kershaw played him at captain. Right now, you're seeing the same thing in our projected ownership, where we have 45% or 46% total ownership going to Buehler, but like 36% of that at captain. So you're a little bit different if you do go with a hitter captain. Then you can afford to maybe get Buehler and Morton both as your flex, and then some decent hitters to fill it out. So that's probably the approach I would lean to, because again, when you're playing single entry or 3 max, those are just smaller field tournaments. Even if a player is 60% owned, just the raw number of players you're competing against that have him is so much lower than in large field tournaments. Your odds of being duped are much lower, and how far off the path you have to get to try and get a solo win is just so much lower that you really don't have to get that crazy in it.
Of course, we do have a giveaway going on our Twitter account, which is at Awesemo_com, where you go over there, see the pinned tweet, and the question is, how many strikeouts will Walker Buehler have in Game 3 tonight of the World Series? Click on the image. I'll let you know all the details you have, how you can get the nice giveaway that we have going on over today at Awesemo.com. Of course, if you ever miss our shows, they are available in podcast form as a part of the Awesemo Podcast Network. If you do have any questions, hit those up in YouTube. We talked a lot about the DraftKings side of things, particularly with the pitchers. Let's talk to our FanDuel players out there in terms of who we should be looking at the MVP and the star spot.
Yeah, so looking at FanDuel right now, you have the most ownership at MVP going to Betts, and then Bellinger, and then Seager. So a bit different than DraftKings. Betts is 9,500, Bellinger is 9K. So they're both expensive relative to the other hitters, but the other hitters, there are so many cheap hitters on FanDuel that it's not really going to be difficult to get to them. But again, anytime you can differentiate a hitter in baseball, it's not a bad idea just because there is so much volatility there. So, maybe looking to an Austin Meadows, who is the 5th highest MVP out of the hitters, as opposed to, a Seager or a Bellinger, makes some sense.
Yeah, one of the questions was about the FanDuel approach this game, a Rays stack or a Dodgers stack.
I don't worry too much about stacking in showdown because you're just naturally going to get them anyway. I think the Dodgers are clearly the preferred side. They just have the better matchup. They're the better offense. They are, of course, more expensive, but on FanDuel, it's still going to be relatively easy to stack either team because like Seager, Bellinger, and Betts are expensive. But other than that, the difference in pricing between a lot of the hitters isn't really that high. Like Justin Turner is not that much more expensive than Meadows or Lau. Will Smith's cheaper than both. Pollock's cheaper than both. Peterson, if he's in, I'm sure is inexpensive. So, I'd prefer the Dodgers side, but again, it's just not something that I worry about too much in showdown because you're just naturally going to get to it anyway.
But like you mentioned a little earlier, the problem with Jock is what happens if it's the fifth inning and all of a sudden a left-handed pitcher's in the game.
Right. He's definitely someone you want to pay a lot of attention to the ownership on, probably even more so than usual, because projections for hitters like that are still going to be relatively high, especially for their salary, because they do so much damage on a per plate appearance basis that it's not like Jack Peterson's going to project for 3 fantasy points, even if you're factoring in his pinch hit risk like you should be, because he's still going to get extra base hits at a relatively high rate. But the floor is lower when you're expecting 2 to 3 plate appearances as opposed to 4 or 5. So I think you want to pay particularly close attention to that ownership, because if he is projected well enough that he's getting into optimal builds, his ownership's going to go up probably a lot higher than it should be in tournaments where, if just throwing a number out, let's say Jock's 40% owned, all I have to do is hope Jack Peterson doesn't hit a home run in one of his first 2 at-bats, and then I get to jump ahead of 40% of the field, So I think you want to pay a lot of attention to the ownership. The flip side of that, too, is keeping in mind that there's no guarantee that your hitter that gets 1 or 2 extra at-bats scores any more points, because, again, you can just line out 4 times. But from an ownership standpoint and comparing it to the chances of success, it does make a difference when the guy's going to get 1 or 2 less opportunities to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm to me, you're hoping that Jock hits a home run in one of those first 2 at bats.
Right.
Because
it's always tough to talk. I mean, it's really difficult to talk about like a 1-game baseball slate, because on 1-game slates in general, there's just so much volatility that edges are going, like you just have to play it so many more times for you to realize your edges. But at the same time, you still want to be pushing every edge that you can. And so like the example I used in game 1 was I saw a lot of really sharp players in cash play Renfroe and Peterson. There were a couple of lineups that projected really, really similarly, and a lot of them went with the Renfroe-Peterson lineup. And to me, it very easily could have won that day. But if you played that slate 1,000 times, that lineup's coming out a little bit behind the ones that went with like Kierme or Lau or something like that, just because of the plate appearances. So it's the same kind of thing. Like there's still a really good chance that Jock Peterson succeeds. It's a very small margin, and it's 1 game, but it's just the kind of thing where if a lot of people are going to roster a hitter that's very likely to be pinch hit for, you're putting yourself in a position over a very large sample to come out ahead.
If you want to get access to all these tools that we're talking about that we have over at Awesemo.com, you got to sign up for an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. Gives you full access to all the premium content on the website, such as player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, and so much more. And if you're only looking for MLB, get an MLB weekly pass for $15.95. Stop guessing, start winning. Join Awesemo Plus today. All you got to do is go to awesemo.com/join, or just go right to the main page. You'll see Awesemo Plus there on the left-hand side of the screen, and sign up for a weekly pass, as I mentioned, to get for almost nearly every DFS sports out there, $29.95 for weekly. If you just want an MLB pass, it is $15.95. As I'm kind of just looking at our ownership on FanDuel in terms of the MVP spot, obviously, I mentioned about earlier, you got the top 3 Dodger bats are ones getting the most, but like, if you're looking for a sneaky Dodger bat, not named Betts, Bellinger, Seager, who is it?
I mean, it's tough, obviously, because those are the 3 that you're most interested in going to. But Justin Turner, is kind of next in line. As far as looking at the matchup specifically, Charlie Morton, he's kind of weird. He struck out. He had a higher strikeout percentage this season against lefties than righties by a pretty wide margin. He struck out 29% of lefties, 21% of righties, but a 211 expected ISO to lefties compared to just shy of 100 against righties. So did give up more power to opposite-handed hitters, as you would expect. So if they put the ball in play, they can have some success there. Obviously, Bellinger and Seager, both lefties, but priced up at the top. Muncy as well. Once you move beyond those guys, you kind of run out of lefties unless you're talking about Jack Peterson, and we've already, dove into that. Mm-hmm. So it is kind of tough with the Dodgers because the best power play, the best home run probabilities basically are all really expensive.
Yeah, I just want to look up Randy Arozarena. As I look at his ownership, I mean, yes, he's priced up, but man, this is a guy that, I mean, he's been the MVP for the Rays in the postseason.
Yeah, he's another one that I think you pay kind of particularly close attention to the ownership because we don't have a track record of him in the major leagues. Like, you can look at steamer projections, you can look at whatever your favorite projection system is, and they project him obviously worse than he has been. I think that the most likely scenario, like when we look back at Randy Arozarena, like 5 years from now, is that he settles in somewhere between where the projection systems had him most likely to end up and what he's done so far. Like, I think there's a really good chance that he is better than he was projected to be. I also don't think there's a very good chance that he is the next Mike Trout or something like that. So you want to pay close attention to ownership on guys like that because his price has come up because of his recent play. And we don't really know if the price is higher or lower than it should be. We won't know that for years, really. Mm-hmm. So that's where ownership becomes an even bigger factor, because when there is a bunch of uncertainty around what we actually expect a player's skill set to be, if the field as a whole is saying, oh, this is the best hitter in this series, like, we're just going to pay whatever price the sites put out there, then you obviously should just be not playing him and hoping that he's not as good as he has been. If, on the other hand, everyone is saying, he's just outperforming his talent and he's way overpriced and nobody's going to roster him, then you roster him because clearly he has the upside and the ability to do what he has done to this point. So whenever you have uncertainty really around the true skill set of a player, I think ownership becomes more important.
To me, it's also, what is the Rays lineup? Who's batting fourth behind him? That, to me, is a question because he's not going to get a good pitch to hit because, just of how he's been doing. So to me, when I'm looking at the Rays lineup, it's going to be, is it Hunter Renfroe? Is it Jamin Choi? Who is batting behind him tonight? That, to me, will be something I'm going to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. Like, you have, if for some reason Renfroe was batting cleanup, like, Buehler is going to be, if it's a situation where, like, it's a 2-0 count, like he falls behind 2-0 on Arozarena, he's probably not going to come back into the zone. He's going to just take his chances with Renfroe behind him. Assuming it's Ji-Man Choi, then you obviously have the left-handed bat and a dangerous left-handed bat at that, for lack of a better word, does protect Arozarena. Where you potentially run into the problem you're talking about is later in the game when the Dodgers bring in a lefty to face Meadows. So they bring in, let's say in the seventh inning, they bring in a lefty to face Meadows. Mm-hmm. Meadows gets pinch hit for. The lefty faces Lau, and then you get a Arozarena coming up. Assuming it's not a situation where, like, the bases are loaded or something, they're probably going to work around the Arozarena and then either go lefty-lefty with Choi or bring in a righty to face whatever righty pinch hits for Choi. So late in the game, I think, is where you're most likely to run into that issue.
Of course, if you do have any questions, hit those right now in the YouTube chat. Also over on Slack, if you got any questions that you want Adam to touch on here. In terms of, looking at that Dodger lineup, you mentioned Justin Turner. That was kind of the guy that I was looking at as potentially maybe someone to put in that captain spot if I don't want to go with those, those big three bats. Cody Bellinger is someone we mentioned before. Should we be talking more about Will Smith?
I think Will Smith's interesting just because his price point is still relatively inexpensive. He's got a lot of power. Will Smith isn't one of these guys that, like, he's a good hitting catcher. He's a good hitter that happens to play catcher. And so I think that there is a little bit of a discount on his salary. He's a little less expensive than Turner, for example. And I don't really know that he should be. I mean, Smith's got a ton of power. I think that he probably should be just as expensive as Turner. And again, it's only a $600 price difference on DraftKings, but that can make a pretty big difference when you're trying to get a piece into your lineup, especially if, you're, for example, not using Kevin Kierme at the bottom. So, I do think Will Smith is a good play. Right now we have on DraftKings 24% combined ownership, only 1.6% captain ownership. So he's certainly the kind of guy where, we had touched on it before, in tournaments being more willing to go with a hitter captain and hope that you hit on the right one. He has more than enough power to be the guy that wins you a tournament at captain.
In terms of strikeout upsides for both these starting pitchers, do you put Morton very similar to Walker, or do you kind of feel like Walker's, baseline is a strikeout or two above Charlie?
Yeah, I think it's higher. For one, Buehler's just a better strikeout pitcher. This season, 28.6% strikeout percentage for Buehler, 24.7% for Morton. Then you factor in the teams that they're facing. The Dodgers are a tough team to strike out. They obviously are just really good hitters across the board, but some pretty low strikeout percentages in this lineup as well. Tampa Bay, I think, a little bit more favorable in that regard. So you get a better strikeout pitcher facing a lineup that strikes out more. So I do give the edge to Buehler.
When you look at those right-handed bats on the Dodgers going up against a right-hander in Morton, is there a right-handed bat that concerns you that maybe they won't pay off their price because of the matchup?
Not too much. I mean, or I guess no more so than usual. Even putting aside the fact that every hitter in baseball is always a risk to not pay off their salary because of just how baseball is and getting zeros. But the righties for the Dodgers, for the most part, are such good hitters. Like Justin Turner's a good enough hitter that I don't really care who he's facing too much. I'm not changing it's not changing how I feel about Justin Turner as a hitter. And the same goes for Will Smith. And then basically no matter who's pitching, I'm going to think Turner and Smith are better than Chris Taylor, for example. So there's not really much that's changing for me in terms of the matchup for the Dodgers hitters.
Like one of the obviously Mookie Betts, we all know one of the best players in the game, but I think what I really love the fact is even if he gets on base as a walk, the potential that he could steal not just second, but we see him go for third as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I think sometimes goes overlooked, but stolen bases can be easier to predict than home runs. Like if guys get on base, there are some guys, if they get on base with nobody ahead of them, they're going to look to run. And, Betts is certainly one of them. I'm pulling up Charlie Morton's numbers now. If I remember correctly, he used to be terrible at holding runners and now he's good. Yeah, that's the case. Like earlier in his career, he was pretty bad. Now he's graded out as above average at holding runners each of the last 4 seasons. So it's not a favorable running matchup, but I would still expect someone like Betts to try and steal a bag.
One of the mentions in YouTube was about, how many pitchers you go with on the DK side of things. Max 3?
Probably max 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I get max 3 works. I mean, it again depends what you're talking about. Like, if you're playing against 30,000 people trying to get a 30% to first prize, I'm not really setting too many restrictions because any sort of negative correlation is offset by the fact that people won't do it, and it gives you a better chance of being unique. So I'm not really too concerned about it. In smaller field stuff, I probably wouldn't roster more than 2, just unless, maybe you could go like Morton, Buehler, Baez or something, because let's say this is a 3-2 game in the 8th or late in the game, Baez is getting in. So, you could go that route. It's not optimal because it's using a relief pitcher. But for example, like if you wanted to go, I don't think there's a problem. Let's say you just took like basically the optimal lineup where Buehler's your captain, Morton's in the lineup, Kevin Kierme is in there. If you take the Kevin Kierme position and make it Pedro Baez, for $400 more, and that's where you're contrarian, I don't think there's any problem to that. So I guess I would say max 3.
Yeah, like as I just kind of look at ownership, I mean, we talked about Rosen Rain. I mean, he's under 10% ownership on DK. I mean, obviously that's price point plays into that. But then you guys, someone like Manuel Margot, who's, I mean, he's approaching Kevin Kiermaier ownership.
Yeah, and Margot is one of those guys that he's in cash for me. Like he's in my cash lineup right now. I'd be very surprised if he's not in my cash lineup at whatever time this game starts. So his ownership is going to be very high because of that. Because if you go into Fantasy Cruncher or whatever optimizer you use, you're just going to get Manny Margot in tons of lineups. He steals bases. He's a good enough hitter. He's probably batting 5th, and he's really inexpensive. In tournaments, you can go against that by just rostering anyone else. If you find $600 for Willy Adames at 10 to 12% lower ownership, that's fine. If you can find money to get to just anyone else. But he is at a price point that's really useful because on DraftKings, the Dodgers are so expensive. There's not really a counterpart on the Dodgers. So you basically just have, as far as looking at value, Kierme, who's getting a ton of ownership, Meadows, who's getting a ton of ownership, Margot and Barnes, both getting a lot of ownership. There's no like low owned value guy. They're all getting ownership.
What's your take on Max Muncy at 9,400?
More so a tournament play for me just because of the price. Like it's going to be really difficult to get to Muncy if you're doing what you should in cash games. Like if you're playing Bueller at captain and then you're putting in Charlie Morton, I'm not sure if it's impossible. It's definitely difficult at the very least to get to Muncy. If you start with those two, you have $6,100 per position. So you're basically not getting to a $9,400 Muncy. At least, not very easily. So he's just not going to end up in good cash lineups, I don't think, because of the rest of the lineup. And in tournaments, it's good. And again, it's the spot where the pricing on DraftKings, I think, is fun in that the hitters at the top, the guys that you really want, Muncy, Seager, Betts, are expensive enough that you have to get off the optimal build to get to them. It's not like you can really just say, oh, I'll play Muncy and I'll lose this one player and I'll be fine. Like you have to make some concessions to do it. And so in tournaments, it makes it appealing because you can get these really high upside bats at relatively low ownership for a 1-game slate, just because you're getting off of the optimal build. So, I think that he's someone that I really like getting to in tournaments. I think he's basically impossible to get to in cash games.
Yeah, I think in tournaments, it's just a matter of, look, it's a majority of lineups are going to have the two starting pitchers in it. So, if you only go with one of those pitchers, who is it? Looking at some of those lower end raised bats that maybe we haven't talked about, Joey Wendell at 7,600, Willie Adames at 6,200.
Yeah, and it's tough with them because they're not the best values and they're not the highest upside plays. Like that's basically the two things you're looking at when you think about the two different formats. Like in cash, you're trying to get the best values in your lineup so that you can get, the best projected lineup. In tournaments, you're trying to get as much upside at preferably lower ownership into your lineup. Neither of those guys really fit that because Adames is more expensive than Margot. He's more expensive than Meadows somehow, and he's more expensive than Kierme. Wendell's more expensive than all of them. Wendell, you're getting into the same price range as like G-Man Choi and AJ Pollock and some Dodgers. So they're not really, they're not the best value and they're not the highest upside guy. That should keep the ownership down. We're still getting some ownership going to Adames because he is cheaper than every Dodger except for Barnes. Joey Wendell coming in, at 17%, which is one of the lower ownership percentages. So they're more so, especially Wendell, guys that you would get to if you're playing 150 lineups, just because you're probably rostering every hitter, at least to some extent. But in like 150, in like 3 max, I doubt that Wendell has a place in a lineup for me. Adames maybe is like a pivot off of Margot.
Of course, over at Awesemo.com right now, our free premium content of the day is MLB player projections, so you can check that out. Over at Awesemo.com, of course, live before lock will be 1 hour before the game tonight. I believe the guys are going to start at 7:15 p.m. each time. First pitch is going to be, I believe, I want to say at 8:08 each time when it's going to go off here. Adam, anything else you want to mention before we get out of here?
No, I think that's about it. The same kind of thought process that goes in. If you're playing large field tournaments on a 1-game slate, don't overthink the correlations. Just, try and put together lineups that have upside. And if it feels kind of gross, it probably won't be duped too much, which is a plus.
Of course, coming up next, we got the NFL Strategy Show right here at Awesemo.com. So keep it out here all day long for all the coverage we have for DFS. Of course, be sure to come back later today for MLB Live Before Lock, 1 hour for Game 3 of the World Series. That's going to do it for this edition of the Strategy Show right here on Awesemo.com.